The crystal chandelier suspended above the dining table hummed with a faint, expensive vibration. Outside, the November wind whipped across the manicured lawns of the Vance estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary, caramelized pecans, and betrayal. Eleanor Vance stood at the head of the mahogany table, her posture flawless. At 60, she possessed the kind of quiet elegance that money couldn't buy, though she had plenty of that, too. She had spent 40 years building Vance Global from a two-room real estate agency into a multi-billion-dollar empire. She had bled for it. She had skipped sleep, survived economic crashes, and sacrificed her youth. But tonight, she wasn't looking at her empire. She was looking at her family. "The turkey is slightly dry, Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice dripping with that practiced, old money charm that had captivated her 3 decades ago. He patted his mouth with a linen napkin, not looking at her. Sitting next to him, a little too close, was Victoria Vance, Arthur's second cousin recently arrived from San Francisco. Or so they had told Eleanor. In reality, Victoria was 32, an aspiring actress, and Arthur's mistress of 2 years. Eleanor knew about the apartment in Manhattan. She knew about the Cartier bracelet currently hidden under Victoria's silk sleeve. "I think it's wonderful, Mom," Julian said quickly, though his eyes remained glued to his phone. Her son. Her only son, whom she had shielded from every harsh reality of the world. Next to Julian sat Chloe, his wife of 3 years. Chloe was a vision in cream Chanel, her smile sharp and perfectly engineered. She was the chief marketing officer of Vance Global, a position Eleanor had gifted her despite the board's reservations. Chloe reached out, her manicured hand gently covering Eleanor's. "You look tired, Eleanor," Chloe whispered, her voice laced with a sickly sweet maternal concern. "Did you take your Aricept this afternoon? You know Dr. Reynolds said the memory lapses will only get worse if you skip the dosage." Eleanor looked down at Chloe's hand. The warmth felt like dry ice. Over the last 3 months, her family had orchestrated a quiet, devastating symphony of gaslighting. Sticky notes with tasks she never agreed to appeared on her desk. Her digital calendar was mysteriously altered, causing her to miss critical board meetings. And then there were the medications. Pills switched, dosages changed, all to manufacture the narrative that Eleanor Vance was slipping into the dark, irreversible fog of early-onset dementia. They didn't just want her out of the company. They wanted her legally declared incompetent, so they could seize her voting shares. "I took my medication, Chloe," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady, devoid of the tremor they so desperately wanted to hear. "Are you sure, darling?" Arthur chimed in, exchanging a brief, heavy look with Chloe. "Yesterday you forgot where you parked the Tesla. We're just worried. The pressure of the new eco-resort project in Belize is too much for you. You should sign the operational proxy over to Julian and Chloe. Let us carry the weight." The eco-resort project. The $45 million black hole. Just 7 days ago, Eleanor had uncovered the truth. The project was a massive Ponzi-style shell company designed to launder money out of Vance Global and into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. But the masterstroke of cruelty wasn't the theft. It was the paperwork. Chloe, utilizing her unrestricted access to Eleanor's digital signatures and personal records, had routed every single fraudulent wire transfer under Eleanor's personal social security number. If the FBI triggered an audit, the paper trail wouldn't lead to Arthur, Julian, or Chloe. It would lead directly to Eleanor. She would be the 60-year-old scapegoat, facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary while they inherited a scrubbed, debt-free empire. The depth of the betrayal was a physical ache in Eleanor's chest. This was the family she had provided for. She had funded Chloe's failed boutique businesses without a word of complaint. She had forgiven Julian's reckless youth. She had loved them with a fierce, unconditional blindness. And in return, they were preparing to lock her in a sanitized room and steal the very ground she stood on. The emotional bridge wasn't just burned, it was reduced to ash. There was no going back. No tearful confrontations, no begging for explanations. They had crossed a line into absolute malice, and Eleanor Vance did not survive 40 years in American corporate warfare by being a victim. "You're right," Eleanor said, stepping back from the table. The room fell silent, save for the clinking of silver against porcelain. "The weight is too heavy." But before we discuss proxies, I have a special Thanksgiving tradition I'd like to introduce this year. She walked over to the sideboard, where the heavy silver platters usually sat. Instead, she picked up a stack of 4 sleek, matte black folders. They were heavy, bound with industrial precision. Arthur frowned, adjusting his glasses. What is that? Legal documents on Thanksgiving? Consider it a manifestation of our shared future, Eleanor said. She walked around the table, placing a folder in front of Arthur, then Julian, then Chloe. She dropped the final folder squarely in front of Victoria, who flinched as if struck. Mom, what is this? Julian asked, finally putting his phone down. His brow furrowed as he looked at the stark black cover. Eleanor walked back to the head of the table. She picked up her crystal baccarat glass, filled to the brim with Dom Perignon. The gold liquid caught the light, casting sharp reflections across the faces of her executioners. She raised the glass, her gaze locking onto Chloe, then Arthur, and finally her son. Her smile was a masterpiece of cold, absolute certainty. Happy Thanksgiving, Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the vaulted dining room. Tonight we aren't giving thanks. We are giving asset disclosures. Because by midnight, most of you are going to federal prison. The silence that followed Eleanor's toast was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. For 5 seconds, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic, expensive ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Arthur was the first to break it, forced laughter barking out of his throat. Eleanor, honestly, I know you've been under a lot of stress lately, but this little stunt is a bit much, don't you think? In front of guests. He shot a performative, apologetic look at Victoria, who was staring at her black folder as if it were a live grenade. Sit down, Arthur, Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a sub-zero chill that cut through his faux charm like a scalpel. She remained standing, her champagne glass resting loosely between her fingers. And don't concern yourself with Victoria. She isn't a guest. She's an accomplice. Though, to be fair to her, she's an incredibly cheap one. A $60,000 Cartier bracelet, and a leased apartment on the Upper East Side to ruin a woman's life? You used to have better taste, Arthur. Victoria's face drained of color. She looked instantly at Arthur, her lips parting in terror. Arthur, what is she talking about? I told you she was getting paranoid. Shut up, Victoria, Chloe snapped, her voice losing its sugary, doting tone entirely. The mask of the perfect daughter-in-law didn't just slip, it dissolved. Chloe's eyes darted from Eleanor to the black folder in front of her. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her posture stiffening into defensive corporate mode. Eleanor, this is exactly what we were talking about earlier. The paranoia. The wild accusations. You're not well. Julian, call Dr. Reynolds. Now. Julian fumbled with his phone, his fingers trembling. He loved the lifestyle his mother provided, but he lacked her spine. Mom, please. You're embarrassing yourself. Let's just put the folders away and go into the living room. Open the folders, Eleanor commanded. She didn't look at Julian. Her gaze was locked entirely on Chloe. Open them, or I will read the contents line by line from memory. And believe me, my memory has never been sharper. Chloe's jaw clenched. With a sharp, defiant flick of her wrist, she flipped open the cover. Julian and Arthur slowly followed suit. Inside the first page of Chloe's folder was a high-resolution photograph. It wasn't a corporate document. It was a digital surveillance photo of Chloe meeting with an executive from Apex Realty, Vance Global's fiercest competitor, at a discreet cafe in New Jersey 3 weeks ago. Attached to it were encrypted email transcripts. Section 1. Eleanor said, pacing slowly along the perimeter of the table, the heels of her Louboutins clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The Apex non-disclosure violation. You didn't just want to steal the Belize eco-resort funds, Chloe. You offered Apex the proprietary bidding algorithms for our upcoming Manhattan waterfront development in exchange for a guaranteed seat on their executive board once Vance Global collapsed. Chloe's breath hitched. She scrambled to flip to the next page, her manicured nails tearing the edge of the paper. Her eyes widened as she stared at the bank routing numbers, the shell company registrations in the Caymans, and the precise, chronological timeline of every single digital signature forged under Eleanor's name. How? Chloe whispered, the arrogance draining from her voice, replaced by a raw, primal panic. How did you get these? The server was secure. You built your marketing career on trends, Chloe, but I built this company on infrastructure, Eleanor said, stopping behind Julian's chair. She placed a heavy, grounding hand on her son's shoulder. Julian flinched, staring at his own folder, which contained the offshore account statements bearing his name as a secondary beneficiary. Julian, Eleanor murmured, her voice softening just enough to let the heartbreak bleed through. When you asked me for $5 million last year to launch your green energy startup, I gave it to you without a single question. Because you are my son. Because I wanted to believe in you. I didn't know you used that money to pay off the gambling debts Chloe hid from me. And I certainly didn't know you would sign a corporate waiver allowing your wife to use my personal credentials as collateral for a $45 million fraud. Mom, I didn't know the extent of it. Julian cried out, his voice cracking. He looked up at her, tears welling in his eyes, the same boyish, helpless look he used whenever he broke a window or crashed a car as a teenager. Chloe said it was just a tax shelter. She said it was standard corporate restructuring to protect your assets. I swear to God, Mom, I didn't know she was setting you up. Julian, shut your mouth. Chloe roared, turning on him like a cornered animal. Don't you dare play the innocent victim now. You wanted the money just as much as I did. You wanted to stop begging your mother for an allowance at 35. Enough, Eleanor said. The single word silenced them both. She looked down at Julian, her heart hardening into stone. The point of no return wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was the reality of looking at her own flesh and blood, and realizing he would have let her rot in a federal cell to keep his lifestyle afloat. The I didn't know defense doesn't hold up in a federal court, Julian. Not when your IP address was used to authorize 3 of the major wire transfers. Arthur finally slammed his folder shut, his face purple with rage. He stood up, towering over the table, trying to use his physical mass to reassert dominance. This is ridiculous. This is an illegal invasion of privacy, Eleanor. You think you're a god because you built this company? You're a bitter, aging woman who has driven her family away with her obsession with control. So what if we moved some money around? So what if we planned for the future? You can't prove a damn thing in a court of law without destroying the Vance name. And you love this company too much to let that happen. He smiled then, a ugly, desperate smirk. You call the feds, and the stock price plummets to 0 by tomorrow morning. You lose everything you worked for. You won't do it. You're bluffing. Chloe caught on, her panic morphing back into a vicious, calculated malice. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. He's right, Eleanor. Your name is on the master fraud documents. If we go down, you go down first, and you go down hardest. The paper trail is an ironclad circle. You call the cops, and you're just handing them your own arrest warrant. We win either way. Eleanor looked at the 3 of them. The husband who had spent her wealth on younger women, the daughter-in-law who had poisoned her daily life with fake medicine and real lies, and the son who was too cowardly to save his own mother. She felt a profound, devastating wave of grief. It was the death of the illusion of her life. But beneath the grief, the cold, calculative brilliance that had made her Eleanor Vance flared to life, brighter and more terrifying than it had ever been. You're right about one thing, Arthur, Eleanor said, setting her champagne glass down with a soft clink. I do love this company. Which is why I spent the last 72 hours ensuring that not a single piece of its scaffolding is attached to any of you anymore. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, black remote control. She pressed the button. From the hallway, the heavy electronic clicks of the estate's smart locks echoed through the house, sealing the front and back doors. Simultaneously, the overhead dining lights flickered, and the large digital display on the dining room wall, usually reserved for family slideshows, flashed to life. It didn't show photos of vacations or birthdays. It showed a live encrypted document feed from the Securities and Exchange Commission, stamped with the current date and a timestamp of exactly 7:15 p.m. Look closely, Chloe, Eleanor whispered, because this is the moment your ironclad circle shatters. The document flashing on the screen was a masterclass in corporate execution. It bore the official digital seal of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, filed under the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. Chloe's eyes scanned the fine print, her pupils dilating as she reached the crucial section. Whistleblower Claim Number 2026 V8841. You see, Chloe, Eleanor began, her voice dropping into a rhythmic, professorial cadence that made everyone at the table feel instantly small. Under federal law, an individual who provides original, verified information regarding corporate fraud is protected from prosecution if they can prove they were an unwilling or manipulated party. More importantly, the SEC offers an absolute immunity clause for executives who act as federal informants before a formal investigation is launched. You turned yourself in? Arthur stuttered, his bravado rapidly melting. He stepped back, his hand shaking as he gripped the back of his chair. I didn't turn myself in, Arthur. I turned you in, Eleanor corrected sharply. I provided 40 years of pristine tax records, an unblemished record of corporate governance, and a complete forensic audit of my personal devices. The forensic team spent 48 hours tracing the exact keystrokes, the specific IP addresses, and the forged digital certificates you used to access my account. They proved that every single fraudulent action was executed from your wing of the house, from Julian's laptop, and from Chloe's corporate tablet. Chloe slammed both hands onto the mahogany table, standing up so violently her chair scraped loudly against the floor. That's impossible. Even if you filed a whistleblower claim, the money is still sitting in the Belize project accounts under your corporate entity. The wire transfers are legal proof of intent to launder. You're just as guilty. Am I? Eleanor tilted her head, a phantom of a smile playing on her lips. She tapped the black remote control again. The screen shifted. The SEC document faded, replaced by a live balance sheet of Vance Global's primary operational account, followed by the private, domestic accounts of Arthur, Julian, and Chloe. As the absolute owner and sole voting shareholder of Vance Global's parent company, I executed an emergency board resolution on Tuesday morning while you two were busy planning my dementia diagnosis, Eleanor explained. I dissolved the Belize Eco-Resort subsidiary due to internal irregularities, but I didn't cancel the $45 million in pending transfers. She walked over to Chloe, stopping just inches away. The scent of Eleanor's expensive French perfume completely overwhelmed the aroma of the dinner. I rerouted the entire $45 million, Eleanor whispered, her voice a dangerous velvet purr. I authorized it as a discretionary, unearned holiday bonus. Look at your screens, Chloe. Look at your personal checking account. Chloe frantically grabbed her phone, her fingers slick with sweat as she punched in her banking app credentials. When the screen loaded, her face went completely, utterly gray. Her breath caught in her throat, a choked, strangled sound escaping her lips. The balance read, $22,500, 000.00. No, Chloe mumbled, shaking her head in denial. This is wrong. This is a mistake. Julian, open yours, Eleanor commanded. Julian, now weeping openly, fumbled with his phone. His balance showed an identical $15 million. Arthur's showed the remaining $7.5 million. You wanted my money so badly that you were willing to put me in a cage for 20 years to get it, Eleanor said, her voice rising just enough to command the entire room. So I gave it to you. Every single cent of the stolen funds is now resting comfortably in your private, personal accounts. You didn't launder money through my entity. You accepted unauthorized, stolen corporate funds directly into your personal possession. In the eyes of the Southern District of New York, you aren't clever entrepreneurs. You are common thieves caught red-handed with the loot. Mom, please, Julian cried, dropping to his knees. He grabbed the hem of her tailored trousers, his face twisted in desperate, pathetic terror. I'll give it back. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll divorce Chloe. Just don't do this to me. I'm your son. Your own flesh and blood. Eleanor looked down at him. For a fleeting second, she saw the little boy who used to hide behind her skirts when he was scared. A deep, agonizing pang of maternal grief pierced her chest. She had carried this boy for 9 months. She had stayed up through his childhood fevers. She had built this entire world, so he would never know the hunger and poverty she had experienced in her own youth. But then she remembered the text message she had intercepted on Arthur's phone just 3 days ago. A text message from this very son, responding to Chloe's plan to commit her to a psychiatric facility. Asterisk, just make sure the facility has good security. We can't have her escaping and causing a scene at the shareholder meeting. Asterisk. The grief in Eleanor's heart crystallized into pure, unyielding diamond. You stopped being my son the moment you traded my sanity for a line of credit, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. She stepped back, breaking his grip. Get up. Have some dignity. Your wife is already calculating how to blame you for the whole thing. Damn right I am, Chloe hissed, her survival instinct taking over. She glared at Julian with utter contempt before turning her venom back to Eleanor. You think you've won? You think this is ironclad? I'll hire the best white-collar defense attorneys in the country. I'll claim you coerced us. I'll claim you set us up because of your declining mental state. The public will believe a desperate, aging mother threw her family to the wolves out of spite. They might have believed that, Chloe, Eleanor said calmly, if you hadn't been so arrogant as to confess to the entire conspiracy right here in this room. Arthur's head snapped up. What? Eleanor turned toward the center of the table. Nestled between the silver gravy boat and the centerpiece of dried autumn flowers was an elegant, frosted glass vase filled with decorative pine cones. She reached in and pulled out a small, sleek black cylindrical device. It wasn't a standard voice recorder. It was a high-grade military-spec audiovisual transmitter, its tiny lens blinking with a steady, malevolent blue light. This is a federal electronic surveillance device, Eleanor announced, holding it up for them to see. Authorized under a Title III wiretap warrant signed by a federal judge at 9 a.m. yesterday morning. Every word you've spoken since we sat down, every admission of the forgery, every acknowledgement of the Belize fraud, your threats to lock me away, and your admission that you wanted me to take the fall, has been streamed directly to a federal mobile command unit parked exactly 2 blocks down the street. A dead, horrified silence descended upon the dining room. Victoria, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly let out a sharp sob. She grabbed her designer purse and bolted toward the dining room doors, her heels clicking frantically. She grabbed the brass handles and pulled. Nothing happened. The heavy oak doors remained firmly locked by the estate's security system. Let me out. I didn't sign anything. I don't know anything about the money, Victoria screamed, pounding on the wood. Arthur, tell her. Tell her I wasn't part of this. Arthur didn't answer. He had sunk back into his chair, his face a mask of total defeat. His chest heaved as the reality of his situation finally crushed him. He was 62 years old. In the federal system, there was no parole. A 15-year sentence for wire fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft meant he would spend the rest of his functional life in a khaki jumpsuit. It's over, Arthur, Eleanor said softly, looking at the man she had shared a bed with for 30 years. You wanted to escape my shadow. Now you'll have a 6x8 cell to call your own. Right on cue, the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens began to pierce the quiet, wealthy serenity of Greenwich. The sound grew louder, sharper, echoing through the cold November night. Red and blue lights began to dance across the pristine white crown molding of the dining room ceiling, cutting through the warm, deceptive glow of the crystal chandelier. Eleanor walked back to her seat at the head of the table. She picked up her glass of champagne, which was still bubbling gently. She looked at the ruined Thanksgiving feast, the cold turkey, the untouched sides, and the shattered lives of the people who had tried to destroy her. She felt no joy. She felt no triumphant rush of adrenaline. She only felt a profound, clean slate. The cancer had been excised from her life, and though the surgery was painful, she was going to survive. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed on the front porch, followed by the booming, authoritative voice of a federal agent. Asterisk FBI. Open the door. Asterisk. Eleanor pressed the button on her remote control, unlocking the front entrance. She took one final, slow sip of her champagne, her eyes reflecting the flashing lights of justice, completely unafraid of the storm she had just unleashed. The heavy oak front doors of the Vance estate did not buckle. They simply yielded as the electronic locks disengaged with a clinical, metallic buzz. The sudden influx of movement into the foyer shattered what little remained of the family's domestic illusion. 6 federal agents, clad in tactical windbreakers with the bold, yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs, moved with practiced, quiet efficiency. They were accompanied by 2 investigators from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, carrying briefcase-sized mobile scanners and evidence kits. Inside the dining room, the atmosphere shifted from corporate standoff to the cold reality of a federal raid. Federal agents. Nobody move. Hands where we can see them. The lead agent, Special Agent Miller, commanded as he entered the dining room. His voice wasn't a cinematic shout. It was a firm, low-frequency authority that immediately sapped the remaining fight out of the room. Julian collapsed entirely against the floor, his face pressed against the expensive Persian rug, weeping uncontrollably. "I didn't do anything. It was Chloe, it was all Chloe," he whimpered, his voice muffled by the wool fibers. He looked pathetic. A 35-year-old man completely undone by the first taste of real consequence. Chloe, however, did not weep. Her survival instinct had curdled into a vicious, cornered desperation. As an agent approached her, she violently wrenched her arm away. "Don't touch me. Do you know who I am? I am the Chief Marketing Officer of Vance Global. This woman is experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. She's staging this. Look at her, she's insane." Agent Miller didn't even look at Chloe. He walked directly to the head of the table, where Eleanor sat. He extended a hand, his expression respectful but grim. "Mrs. Vance, we have the live audio and video feed securely logged on our servers. The Title III wiretap data has been synchronized with the SEC whistleblower filing. We're taking over the scene now." "Thank you, Agent Miller," Eleanor said. Her voice was the only calm thing left in the house. She did not rise from her chair. She didn't want to stand on the same level as the people who had tried to bury her. She remained seated, the matriarch observing the dismantling of her own house. The digital forensic files, including the encrypted hard drives where the forged signatures were generated, are in the study. My attorney has already emailed your field office the decryption keys. Hearing this, Chloe stopped struggling against the agent who was pulling her arms behind her back. The finality of Eleanor's words hit her like a physical blow. The encryption keys. Eleanor hadn't just watched them. She had systematically mapped their entire digital infrastructure. "You bitch," Chloe hissed, her face contorting into something unrecognizable. The polished, Chanel-clad executive was gone. In her place was a broken scammer. "You planned this. You let us transfer the money. You let us think we were winning just so you could do this." "I didn't make you forge my name, Chloe," Eleanor said, her gaze turning to her daughter-in-law. There was no anger in Eleanor's eyes, only a vast, empty vacuum of disappointment. "I didn't make you open those offshore accounts. I simply gave you the rope you asked for, and you chose to hang yourself with it. You wanted my seat at the table so badly, but you forgot that I built the table." The metallic click of handcuffs ratcheting around Chloe's wrists echoed through the high-ceilinged room. For a woman who defined her entire existence by appearance, the sound of steel meeting skin was the ultimate execution. She was let out first, her heels dragging against the floor, leaving scuff marks on the pristine wood. Next was Arthur. He didn't fight. When the agent approached him, Arthur simply held out his wrists, his head bowed. The arrogant, charming man Eleanor had married 30 years ago looked suddenly frail, his tailored suit hanging loosely on his shoulders. He looked at Eleanor once before the cuffs went on, a desperate, pleading look that begged for a shred of the mercy she had given him for decades. Eleanor looked back, but she felt nothing. The man who had shared her bed had conspired to gaslight her into a mental institution. He had smiled at her across the breakfast table, while calculating the dosage of medication that would make her appear incompetent to a judge. That wasn't just a betrayal of a marriage. It was an attempt to erase her very existence. The emotional currency had been completely spent. Arthur was a stranger to her now, a ghost wearing her husband's clothes. "Eleanor," Arthur whispered, his voice cracked. "Please. The family name. Think of the legacy." "The legacy is mine, Arthur," Eleanor replied softly. "I built it. You were merely a passenger who forgot who was driving." As Arthur was led away, Victoria broke down into hysterics, screaming that she was just an actress, that she didn't know anything about wire fraud or bank accounts. The IRS investigators ignored her protests, reading her rights as they escorted her out to a separate vehicle. She had accepted a luxury apartment and fine jewelry purchased with stolen corporate funds. In the eyes of the law, ignorance was not a sanctuary. Then there was Julian, her son. The agent had lifted him from the floor, holding him upright by his arms. Julian's face was red, swollen with tears and snot, his tie askew. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes wild with panic. Mom, please. You can't let them take me, he begged, trying to pull toward her. I'm your boy. Remember when we went to Maine? Remember what you told me? You said you'd always protect me. Mom, that was the highest leverage point, the ultimate emotional no-return. Julian was weaponizing her own maternal love against her, digging into the sacred memories of his childhood to save himself from the consequences of his adulthood. For a fraction of a second, the mother and Eleanor wanted to scream, to tell the agents to stop, to take the blame herself just to protect her child. It was an instinct buried deep in her DNA, a primal urge that nearly suffocated her. But Eleanor looked at the black folder remaining on the table. She remembered the cold, calculated text message Julian had sent about securing a facility, so she wouldn't cause a scene. He hadn't thought about Maine when he signed those papers. He hadn't thought about her protection when he watched Chloe alter her digital calendar. He had traded her life for convenience and cash. If she protected him now, she wouldn't be saving her son. She would be enabling his destruction of her. I did protect you, Julian, Eleanor said, a single, hot tear finally escaping her eye, tracing a path down her flawless cheek. It was the only tear she would allow herself tonight. I protected you from the world for 35 years. And look what it made you. A man who would lock his own mother away to pay for his wife's vanity. I cannot protect you from yourself anymore. Mom. No. Don't do this. Mom. Julian screamed as the agents guided him toward the foyer. His voice echoed down the long hallway, growing fainter and fainter until the heavy front door slammed shut, cutting off his cries entirely. The house fell into a sudden, jarring silence. The federal agents remained in the other rooms, systematically cataloging evidence, but the dining room was empty save for Eleanor and Agent Miller. The feast was cold. The crystal glasses stood half-filled, catching the fading reflections of the emergency lights outside as the police cruisers began to pull away from the driveway. Are you going to be all right, Mrs. Vance? Agent Miller asked quietly, placing a temporary security seal on the dining room sideboard. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath. She reached up and wiped the single tear from her cheek, her expression hardening back into the impenetrable marble that had terrified Wall Street for decades. I am perfectly fine, Agent Miller, Eleanor said, standing up from the head of the table. She smoothed down her tailored jacket, her posture immaculate. In fact, for the first time in 3 months, I remember exactly who I am. The flashing red and blue lights outside finally drifted away, leaving the sprawling dining room illuminated only by the cold, stagnant glow of the crystal chandelier. The FBI had cleared out of the immediate space, shifting their operation down the hall to the West Wing study where the corporate servers and digital forensic trails were being systematically copied into federal evidence drives. Eleanor stood entirely alone at the head of the mahogany table. The room felt cavernous now, stripped of the manicured laughter and suffocating arrogance that had filled it just an hour ago. She looked down at the untouched Thanksgiving spread, the gold-rimmed porcelain plates, the crystal goblets half-filled with flat Dom Perignon, the silver carving knives catching the dim light. It was a beautiful graveyard. Her cell phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with the name Diane Sterling, ESQ, her personal attorney and closest confidant for 30 years. Eleanor picked it up, her fingers steady despite the emotional vacuum echoing in her chest. It's done, Diane, Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a quiet, gravelly register. The federal field office just confirmed the arrivals, Eleanor. Diane's voice came through the encrypted line, sharp, professional, yet tinged with a deep, personal sorrow. Arthur, Julian, and Chloe are being processed as we speak. The Southern District is already drafting the formal arraignment. Because of the whistleblower filing and the live wiretap evidence, The judge has already indicated that bail will be set exceptionally high, if not denied entirely due to flight risks from the offshore funds. And the company? Eleanor asked, her eyes tracking a stray drop of gravy that had dried on the linen tablecloth. Vance Global is completely secure, Diane assured her. The emergency board resolution you filed on Tuesday went through smoothly. The board has stripped Julian and Chloe of all corporate titles effective immediately, citing the internal audit. Tomorrow morning, when the markets open, we are releasing a controlled press statement framing this as an internal cleanup led by you, the founder. The stock will take a minor hit from the shock, but your transparency will stabilize it by noon. You saved the empire, Eleanor. I saved the empire, Eleanor repeated softly. But you lost the family, Diane concluded, her voice softening into that of a friend who had watched Eleanor sacrifice everything for her boy. Are you going to be okay? Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She hung up the phone and walked over to the grand floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sweeping, dark expanse of the Greenwich estate. The November wind was punishing now, rattling the heavy glass panes, stripping the last dead leaves from the ancient oak trees she had planted when Julian was born. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. She could still hear Julian's voice echoing in the hallway. Mom. I'm your boy. Protect me. It was a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her days. She had spent his entire life protecting him, shielding him from the cutthroat nature of the business world, giving him a softer life than the one she had endured. And that very protection had grown him into a man weak enough to watch his wife slow poison his mother's mind for a larger share of the inheritance. She hadn't just defeated her enemies tonight. She had realized that she had raised one of them. That was the deepest, most agonizing cut. Chloe's betrayal was corporate strategy. Arthur's betrayal was marital decay. But Julian's betrayal was a systemic failure of her own maternal legacy. She walked back to the table and picked up Chloe's abandoned silver fork. She remembered how Chloe used to sit at this exact table during Sunday dinners, smiling warmly, pouring Eleanor's tea, and asking for advice on how to be a strong woman in business. All the while, Chloe had been secretly meeting with Apex Realty, mapping out Eleanor's digital signatures, and whispering to the board that Eleanor was losing her mind. The cold, calculated cruelty of the gaslighting made Eleanor shudder. They had moved her car keys. They had altered her medication. They had looked her in the eyes every single day with faux concern, waiting for her to break down, waiting for her to cry so they could use her tears as evidence of incompetence. They didn't just want her wealth. They wanted to strip her of her dignity, her sanity, and her name. They wanted her to die a slow, psychological death in a sanitized room while they threw parties in her house. Eleanor dropped the fork. It hit the porcelain plate with a sharp, ringing clack that sounded like a gavel falling. No, she would not mourn them. They had forfeited their right to her grief the moment they turned her love into a weapon. She had survived 40 years of Wall Street sharks, economic collapses, and cutthroat boardrooms. She hadn't survived all of that to be taken down by a greedy husband, an ambitious daughter-in-law, and a cowardly son. She walked out of the dining room, her heels clicking firmly against the marble floor of the grand hallway, completely ignoring the federal agents who were packaging laptops into static-proof bags in the adjacent rooms. She climbed the grand staircase, her posture straight, her gaze fixed forward. She entered her private master suite, a sanctuary of muted tones, expensive art, and absolute silence. She walked over to the built-in safe hidden behind a mahogany panel, punched in the biometric code, and opened it. Inside, tucked away next to her original land deeds and stock certificates, was a small velvet box. She opened it to find a simple silver key, the key to her private estate in Zurich, Switzerland. A place she bought decades ago and had never visited. A place where the Vance name meant nothing, and her peace meant everything. Eleanor closed the box, her heart hardening into its final, permanent shape. The war was over. The traitors were in chains. The empire was secure. Now it was time for the architect to leave the building. The silver key felt cold against Eleanor's palm, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the drama that had just consumed her home. She closed her hand around it, letting the sharp edges dig slightly into her skin, a grounding sensation that reminded her she was still entirely in control. Downstairs, The heavy front door opened and shut one last time. The rhythmic hum of the FBI's mobile command unit outside finally faded into the distance, leaving the estate enveloped in a sudden, unnatural silence. The agents had finished cloning the servers. The evidence was logged. The house was hers again. But as Eleanor walked back down the grand staircase, she realized she no longer wanted it. She stepped into the dining room. The remnants of the Thanksgiving feast sat under the dimming chandelier like artifacts from a ruined civilization. She walked over to the head of the table, picked up her purse, and pulled out her tablet. It was 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. 15 minutes until the traps she had set completely locked into place. She opened the secure portal to the Vance Global Corporate Database. With a few precise keystrokes, she authorized the immediate release of the pre-drafted press package to the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. The headlines would drop at exactly 6 a.m. Vance Global founder exposes multi-million-dollar internal fraud. CFO and CMO arrested. Next, she accessed her private banking application. The $45 million that she had routed into Arthur, Julian, and Chloe's personal accounts was currently flagged by the federal government as seized evidence. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She executed a master-level corporate clawback. Under the Vance Global bylaws, any funds distributed as a result of fraudulent or unearned activity were subject to immediate, automatic forfeiture back to the parent company's reserve treasury. She watched the digital numbers cascade. With a single tap of her finger, she stripped the money back out of their frozen accounts, leaving Arthur, Julian, and Chloe not just imprisoned, but utterly, entirely destitute. When they went to hire their high-priced white-collar defense attorneys tomorrow morning, they would find their retainers rejected. They would be assigned public defenders. They would fight a federal racketeering case with the bare minimum the state could provide. This was the final twist, the absolute checkmate. They had tried to use her own corporate structure to cage her. She had used the exact same architecture to bury them under the weight of the law, stripping them of the very wealth they had betrayed her to obtain. Mung. Eleanor turned. Her head of security, a retired non-commissioned officer named Marcus who had been with her for 20 years, stood at the entrance of the dining room. He held a long, black wool coat and her leather travel bag. His expression was completely neutral, but his eyes held a deep, quiet respect. He had seen the whole thing play out on the security feeds. "The car is ready, Mrs. Vance," Marcus said softly. "The flight to Zurich is cleared for departure at 1:30 a.m. Eleanor took the coat from him, slipping it over her shoulders. The heavy fabric felt like armor. She took one last look at the dining table, her gaze lingering on Julian's empty chair. The heartbreak was still there, a dull, permanent ache in her chest, but it no longer had the power to make her hesitate. "Thank you, Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice steady and resolute. "Let's go." As she walked through the foyer, she didn't look back at the grand portraits of the Vance family lining the walls. She didn't look at the luxury that had bred such lethal entitlement. She stepped out into the crisp, biting November night air, the wind catching the collar of her coat. A sleek, black town car waited at the bottom of the steps, its exhaust piping white steam into the dark. Marcus opened the door for her, and Eleanor stepped inside, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud that shut out the world. As the car pulled down the long, winding driveway of the Greenwich estate, Eleanor looked out the tinted window. The house grew smaller and smaller in the distance, until it was completely swallowed by the darkness. She leaned back against the leather seat, closing her eyes as the car sped toward the airport. The empire was secure. The traitors were handled. The board was hers. She had won the war, not by matching their cruelty, but by relying on the one thing they had completely underestimated: her unyielding brilliance. The private jet climbed steadily into the ink-black Atlantic sky, leaving the fractured remnants of Eleanor's life 30,000 feet below. Inside the cabin, the ambient lighting was soft, casting a warm glow over the cream leather interior. There were no sirens here. No screeching recriminations. No desperate pleas from a son who had traded her sanity for a line of credit. There was only the low, white noise hum of the engines pushing her toward a quiet dawn in Switzerland. Eleanor sat by the window, a porcelain cup of black coffee resting untouched on the polished wood table in front of her. She looked out into the vast, empty dark. Her tablet lay face down beside her. She didn't need to look at it to know that the corporate wires were already buzzing. In less than 2 hours, the morning editions of the financial papers would hit the doorsteps of Wall Street, and the world would know exactly what transpired at the Vance estate on Thanksgiving night. She had saved the empire. Her legacy was intact, her name vindicated. But as the plane leveled out at its cruising altitude, the cold adrenaline of the battlefield began to evaporate, leaving behind the heavy, suffocating weight of the truth. She had won, but the victory tasted like ash. The high leverage point of a mother's love is that it doesn't simply vanish when it is betrayed. It stays inside you, mutating into a profound, hollow grief. Eleanor closed her eyes. And for a fleeting moment, she wasn't the billionaire matriarch who had just orchestrated a flawless federal sting. She was just a mother remembering the smell of her baby's hair, the weight of his small hand in hers, the fierce, consuming promise she had made to herself 40 years ago that her child would never know the cold, unforgiving hunger of the world. She had kept that promise too well. In shielding Julian from every harsh reality, she had failed to teach him the cost of the ground he walked on. She had inadvertently created a vacuum where entitlement grew into malice, and arrogance grew into a weapon. The ultimate emotional lesson of Eleanor's life didn't come from her corporate rivals or her unfaithful husband. It came from the realization that sometimes, the people we destroy ourselves to build are the ones who will gladly use the bricks to bury us alive. But Eleanor Vance was not a woman who allowed herself to be buried. She opened her eyes, her gaze sharpening as she looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the cabin window. The grief was there, permanent and etched into the lines around her eyes. But beneath it was the unbreakable foundation of who she was. She had built a multi-billion-dollar empire in a world designed to keep women like her out of the room. She had survived economic crashes, boardroom coups, and a calculated attempt to erase her mind. She would survive this too. She reached for her coffee, the warmth of the porcelain seeping into her fingers. Trust, she realized, was a luxury she had afforded the wrong people for far too long. But self-preservation was not a luxury, it was a duty. Blood mattered, legal titles mattered, but loyalty was the only currency that held real value. And those who traded loyalty for greed would always find themselves bankrupt in the end. Arthur, Julian, and Chloe would spend the next decade learning that lesson behind concrete walls. Stripped of the wealth and status they had tried to steal, they would have to face the cold reality of their choices without her there to clean up the mess or soften the blow. For the first time in his life, Julian would have to grow up, and he would have to do it in a federal penitentiary. The jet chased the sunrise eastward, a thin ribbon of gold finally breaking across the horizon, bleeding light into the dark sky. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee. The ache in her chest didn't disappear, but the air felt cleaner now. The house had been cleared of its rot. She leaned her head back against the seat, watching the morning light flood the cabin. The past was a closed book, sealed with handcuffs and federal warrants. The future was unwritten, quiet, and entirely her own. Eleanor Vance had survived the storm of her family's making. And as she flew toward the peace she had so fiercely reclaimed, she knew she was finally, beautifully free.